paper is Development, Globalization and Society, and the module that we are going to discuss is Gender Critique of the Development Process. The objective of the module include to introduce students to the way development policies are structured. Secondly, to examine how the state addresses the development concern of the marginalized, especially women in poverty, and to introduce the students to the way feminist scholars have tried to engender development policies. So let's try and understand what is gender planning and development discourse all about. Feminist academics, advocates, and women organizations have made the case that development planning and practice has not taken in account unequal gendered power relation. The development discourse has perceived women as submissive recipients of state largesse. Women are the major consumers of welfare services because of the ways in which state support is designed to substitute for husband wages, presupposing women's exclusion from the labor market. Thus, women's positions remain unchanged and has in certain cases worsened. Let's understand what is the scenario in our own country, India. To understand the gendered nature of the development process, one has to locate women within complex history of policy intervention for women development in the country. The literature on women and development in India have focused on number one, how in the course of economic development, dependence on market condition, technological options, and socio-legal institutions has consistently had devastating effect on Indian women's work and employment. Secondly, analysis has been done on two broad phases, late 1930s to late 1970s and early 1980s onwards. Let's understand women's role in planned economy. Planning has been a very important policy for addressing the development concerns of Indian women. The instance of addressing women's concern into development was as early as 1939 when a document titled Women Role in Planned Economy was framed by the Subcommittee of National Planning Committee under the chairpersonship of the first Prime Minister of India, Pandit Nehru. This committee was appointed to look into women's role in a planned economy and thus was an important text on development for women. Feminists refer to this document as the first attempt to write a blueprint for the development of Indian women. The plan document envisaged the role of Indian women as productive, independent, thinking individual and not as an appendage to their family. The report addressed women issues holistically and incorporated the social, economic and legal concerns of the women. Some of these issues addressed in the document are the right of women to independent economic resources, education and opportunity in all spheres. Demanded recognition of a domestic labor, need for maternity benefit which included child and maternity home, creche for all women be it home or employment outside home. Political rights included voting right and the right to hold public offices. In this document, women were perceived as independent, productive individuals who have rights to demand the existence of state-maintained support structure so as to facilitate their productive role in society. It was far more liberating than the scheme designed for Indian women in the post-independence period through the instrument of planning. It is unfortunate, argues Desai and Thakkar, that this progressive policy on women was lost and not referred to when the planning process was inaugurated in the post-independence period for women. Following independence, political rights were granted to Indian women through universal franchisee, but their social and economic rights were classified under non-justifiable directive principles of state policy. The directive principles of state policy are guidelines to keep the central and state governments of India. They have to keep it in mind while framing laws and policy for its citizen and the country. These provisions contained in Part 4 of the Constitution of India are not enforceable by any court, but the principles laid down therein are considered fundamental in the governance of the country, making it the duty of the state to apply these principles in making laws to establish a just society in the country. They aim at achieving social and economic democracy for establishing a welfare state. Directive principles are classified under the following categories: Gandhian, economic and socialistic, political and administrative, justice and legal, environmental protection and protection of monuments and peace and security. Under directive principle of state policy, women's right to work, adequate livelihood, control and access to resources, and equal wages with men, which are of critical importance to poor women, were not made as fundamental rights. Classifying this under directive principles of state policy allowed state an arbitrary role to design policies addressing the development concern of women relating to social and economic right. Now let's do the decades. To start with, 1950s and the 1960s. Development theories and ideologies in the early post-colonial decade of the 50s and 60s envisaged a direct role for the state in alleviating the poverty of the vast million of the people. The first government action of post-independence India was to initiate a massive process of social, economic and political transformation of society. Planning became the instrument to usher in development process, where its role was not only to direct economy on the projected path but also to have distributional role as well. Efforts to radicalize and restructure the economy were parallel by efforts to socially reform and modernize a largely agricultural society. Central to this was the notion of the planned economy. There were certain areas which were identified by the Planning Commission, and these were three areas of special focus for India's women development: education, social welfare and health. Till the sixth five-year plan, the approach to women issue was mainly welfare-oriented, celebrating the image of the nurturing and the caring mother. For example, under health program, the focus was maternal and child health services, supplementary feeding for children, and for nursing an expectant mother. Let's now do the gender analysis post-independence period. Gender analysis of the scheme in the first few years post-independence in India revealed two major shortcomings. First, there was no special effort to integrate specific needs of women, and second, it focused on the household and was not sensitive to unequal power relations operating within it. The major assumption was that the household is a unit of congruent interest among whose members the benefit of available resources are shared equitably irrespective of the gender. Debates on women and development. Under this theme, gender critique talks about that during the 70s how there was a lot of debate in this area. These debates were primarily because of three interrelated factors. Firstly, Committee on the Status of Women in India in form of Towards Equality report in 1974, the mushrooming of women organization loosely constituting women's movements in the late 1970s, and change of perspective with regard to women's role in economic development in the international context. Let's understand what did the Towards Equality report talk about. The Towards Equality report stated that the secondary and subordinate position of women was a result of a patriarchal nature of mainstream development process. The report also stated that women, and in particular poor women, fared worse in social, economic and political indicators of development. Additionally, the government was not acknowledging the role of women in development. It pressurized the state to take cognizance of the fact that a top-down and additive approach to the Indian women development concern does not address the needs of the woman. The committee recommended on conducting research to gather data on gender discrimination in employment, education, land redistribution, inheritance, nutrition and health began to be collected and theorized on. Towards Equality report reiterated the need to design a development model that addresses the specific needs of women. This all led to women's movement. The new women movement in late 70s and early 80s, through campaigns on rape and dowry, conceptualized women concern with a gendered framework. Through the campaign, a gendered critique of the patriarchal structure of the state and its policies were made. The upsurge of mass movement in late 60s and early 70s, which articulated the discontent of Indian citizens with the development model, also emphasized the need to rethink the developmental model. Kabir and Saunders argue that the two interconnecting factors led to a recognition of women as a constituency in development process. The first was the effort by academics such as Bosurup in 1970, who showed how women played a critical role in agriculture production in sustaining local and national economies. The second was the growing realization that the process of colonialism and modernization have had a negative impact on the economies of sub-Saharan Africa and the third world countries, and that in the third world country one could see women's increased marginalization. Therefore, there was a growing demand that women must be integrated into the development process as active economic agents if the countries are to truly prosper. Another influence was the social movement by women in the 60s and the 70s against male domination and oppression. It also involved a process of theorizing on patriarchy on lines of three theoretical perspectives: liberal, radical, and the Marxist socialist feminism. What was the impact of this discourse? There was a recognition that women issues have development policy implication, and there is a need to change the focus of development policies from welfare to economic efficiency. This pressurized the United Nations to take cognizance of women concerned into the development process as productive citizens. The declaration of 1975-85 by United Nations as the United Nations Decade for Women was equally important. The impact of this was seen in terms of research, funding, dissemination, media coverage, and pressure on countries to generate gender-specific data and status of women report. This gender critique of its development model made the Indian state structure its program in the 80s within the new perspective called Women in Development, or WID. It is recognized that the adverse impact of inappropriate economic development program and its data gathering efforts, which did not recognize women's work and treated them as merely mothers. The policy of the state were critiqued by Indian feminists, arguing that it focused on merely women issue and not on gendered relations of power and inequality. Krishna Raj and Banerjee argued that women's contribution to the economy remains hidden because their work, especially in agriculture, remains unremunerated. Women's work is categorized within unproductive work for which payment is not made. This unpaid work includes activity inside and outside home and in agriculture, which are not classified under conventional categories of work. To a great extent, women's work remains unaccounted and unreflected in the census. This lacuna has an adverse impact on government development policies for women. Agarwal critiqued development policies of the Indian state and argued that these treated gender as an additive category rather than as an analytical category. They do not perceive gender as a lens through which approach to development should itself be re-examined. Gender poverty is related to a lack of access to productive resources, and thus poverty elevation can be addressed only by removing the structural constraint. State-based program on welfare notion of provision of basic needs, that is food, education, and healthcare, without questioning the existing distribution of productive resources and political power or the social, caste, class, gender division of labor. Most governments typically deliver such program in a top-down manner involving little dialogue with the people, especially women themselves, on the definition of their need or the best means of meeting of those needs. Agarwal demanded that women be given land right to address the structural poverty among them. Land rights for women are one of the major ways that could remove the structural constraint. Women in development. Feminists critique women in development policies on primarily three counts. First, Saunders and Kabir argued that the women in development approach focus on programs of poverty alleviation and provision of basic need and thereby reinforced the Agarwal's argument. This view cast women into the role of manager of low-income household. It did not address the issue of women's unequal access to resources and power. Such an approach made it more acceptable to male-dominated agencies and did not challenge the structures of inequality and maintained a status quo. Secondly, Young argued that women in development policy was driven by the liberal ideology that believed in a universal category of women and their experience without being sensitive to the difference of class, caste, race, and ethnicity. This critique draws attention to the fact that the erasure of women's experience of poverty differs in relation to her location within the social structure. Thus, while emphasizing the similarities and the need for organizing for a global sisterhood, the women in development advocates fail to take cognizance of material differences of power, resources, and interest between women themselves. Thirdly, Kabir argues that the theoretical thrust of WID was not sensitive to the structural inequalities within the development process itself. As a result of this insensitivity to structural inequalities, even after years of implementing WID policy, women continued to occupy a marginal place in development thought and policy. They were incorporated very often on symbolic terms. Further, this ideology did not provide space to challenge the dominant hierarchy of development priorities, which consistently privileged the domain of production of men over reproduction, where women were assigned primary responsibility. The Dawn perspective. An alternate theory to the dominant women in development perspective of the Western feminists was articulated by the Southern feminists and is called Dawn. Dawn stands for Development Alternative for a New Era. a network of activists, policymakers, and researchers from the Third World, argued that the development model was itself lopsided and favored the powerful and resourceful of the First World, and that the problem of development were not unique to the Third World. Dawn model argued for a development model that would be based on lived experiences of poor women, which would take into account the structure of caste, class, ethnicity that is central to an understanding of poverty and social inequality. It argued for an empowerment approach that would address the issue of gendered power relations. Thus, the need to recognize the multiple patriarchies within development model was emphasized. Dawn began in Bangalore, India in 1984 with a meeting of women activists, researchers, and policymakers from Third World country. It focused initially on preparing for the 1985 Nairobi conferences by producing an analysis of issues of development for the perspective of the Third World women, which resulted in a series of workshops in Nairobi and the book Development, Crisis and Alternative Visions, published by Dawn in 1985 and subsequently reissued in Geeta Sen and Karen Groen edited Development, Crisis and Alternative Visions. In 1986, the Dawn office moved from India to Sao Paulo, and the group created several commissions to develop strategies for advancing the cause of development free of gender, class, race, or national oppression. The alternative voice is a challenge to the hegemonic ideology in the development process of the First World War over the developing country of the Third World. Gender and development. The impact of Dawn perspective was perceived in the policy of gender and development. This policy aimed at conceiving development strategies that would reshape power relationship, especially in the context of gender, the socially acquired notion of masculinity and femininity, and gender relation, the socially constructed form of relation between men and women. Young argues that GAD activists highlighted two significant issues. First, they questioned the conventional liberal belief that the market economy would help spread egalitarian values and undermine authoritarian and male-based traditional attitudes. Secondly, they also highlighted an aspect of unequal relations, violence against women, which in many areas inhibited women from taking up opportunities targeted to them, such as literacy classes, credit, agricultural extension activities. Early 19 onwards, there was a certain change, which we will chronicle now. Agrawal argues that the critique of the feminist and policy development at the international level pressurized the state in changing its approach towards addressing development concern for women in two ways. First, the establishment of independent cells, departments and ministries in government, bureaucracies to monitor and coordinate women's concern in development process. Secondly, initiation of a special program targeted at women, especially income generating, extension of credit and literacy scheme. This policy was reiterated in the Policy Directive on Women and Development in the planning process as in 6th Five-Year Plan 1980 to 85. In this regard, the Department of Women and Child Development in 1985 under the Ministry of Human Resources was set up. This department had major responsibility of reviewing of laws to remove gender bias, campaigning for equal rights to women in property, access to credit, designing income-generating opportunity, and providing support services such as daycare facilities, creche, working women hostels, and etc. To this end, the 6th Five-Year Plan, for the first time in a chapter on women's development, focusing on three areas of health, education, and employment, were included. This plan emphasized economic independence, educational advancement, and access to health care and family planning. Efforts were made to formulate a special committee on women in various departments of the government to ensure that women issues get incorporated in the system. From the late 19 onwards, things moved ahead. The state introduced gender budgeting in its program and policy. In the 9th Five-Year Plan, which ran from 1997 to 2002, a specific women component plan was formulated, which directed both the central and the state government to ensure that not less than 30% of the fund benefits are earmarked in all women-related sector. Further, from the 10th Plan, 2002 to 2007 onward, this became a policy and effort were made to reinforce gender commitment into budgetary commitments, stressing on the importance of gender budgeting. However, critics such as Sujaya argue that neither in the 9th nor in the 10th Plan one could see sensitivity on the part of the policymakers to perceive poverty holistically. The only specific policy direction of addressing poor women was the affirmative action of reserving a percentage of benefit of anti-poverty program for below poverty line women. The Government of India titled the 11th Plan towards faster and inclusive growth. Feminist academicians have criticized it as a disappointing because it adopts an uncritical trickle-down approach to economic growth. Gender aspects are included in a section titled Gender Balancing, highlighting a stereotype understanding of women's role. The plan focuses on 3 areas specific to women: violence against women, economic empowerment, and women's health. Though the focus area is specified, there seems to be little discussion on strategies to be adopted to tackle these issues, except for a statement that appropriate provision in government policies are to be made. Though the focus area is specified, there seems to be little discussion on strategies to be adopted to tackle these issues, except for a statement that appropriate provision in government policies are to be made. Women organizations have critiqued the 11th plan by stating that the plan has not addressed 2 issues important for poor women: increasing landlessness and absence of food security. Continuing the analysis of the planning process, it is argued that the 12th five-year plan approach reveals insufficient awareness of the specific problem of women, their unpaid labor, their distinctive economic contribution to the nation's economy. Policy approaches of the 12th plan are to stimulate growth through creating opportunities for the entrepreneurial class by liberalizing domestic and global market. Such an approach, feminist scholars analyzing the plan argue that it would not lead to inclusion. Instead, for the inclusive growth, one needs to have livelihood-centered growth strategies. Indian feminist critique of the Indian planning process over the last few decades raised 2 important issues. First, the critique of the Indian planning process. Secondly, the co-option of the feminist concept of gender mainstreaming, empowerment, and gender budgeting. On the first issue, feminists argue that the Indian planning process did not address the notion of multiple patriarchies. In India, multiple patriarchies operate through structure of caste, class, and ethnicity that determine the nature of gender relation. It is based on the relations of power between men and women. The power relation is expressed in a range of practices, ideas, and representations, including sexual division of labor, roles, and distribution of resources between women and men. The large number of development programs for women do not address these multiple patriarchy, and efforts to incorporate women concerns have often remained piecemeal. The binary of public-private, productive-reproductive, economic-cultural have formed the basis of development policies for women. Development policies of the Indian state, according to Swaminathan, there is nothing in our public policy that is geared towards tackling the systematic nature of class, gender, and caste-based discrimination. This is so because caste and gender inequalities are structural in nature and cannot be rectified by addressing individual or even individual household, which is generally the focus of development policy of the Indian state. In conclusion, one can state that globally there is a trend of state shrinking from addressing development, analyzed as a shift from welfare development state to the pragmatic, efficient corporation dealing with its citizens as consumer. This shift was not only observed within the philosophical ideological framework of development, but tends to also get reflected in the specific policies and programs that were initiated and implemented by the state. Thank you.